Thank you so much, everyone. Wonderful being here. Thank you for that introduction. You were very generous to refer to speakers. As you may hear, I'm recovering from a throat infection, so speaking is actually a little bit troublesome right now. And those of you who know me know that that's a fairly big handicap for me. But by way of introduction, let me just say how John and I are planning to go through this. And let me therefore also say what this report is, and perhaps most importantly, at the start, what it is not, right? This is not a generalized report on Chinese electric vehicles and drones in the Netherlands. We were asked to look at data, at the risk that personal and sensitive Dutch data might end up in Chinese hands through Chinese vehicles and drones. And that means that we have not been looking at questions of economic security. We have not been looking at questions of supply chain dependencies. We have not been looking at, for instance, issue related to production facilities in Xinjiang and any of that. The only thing that we've been looking at in relation to Chinese vehicles and drones is the question of data security. These other topics, they're very important. But they're not what we're discussing today. And so also for the discussion, I think it would help to sort of state this straight away so we don't end up in a conversation that veers into every direction. The question that we were asked, because this was a project that was set by a range of ministries, including Defense and the NCTV, was twofold. On the one hand, what are the Chinese legal and regulatory frameworks that might enable the Chinese state to acquire data from Chinese branded vehicles and drones in Europe, in the Netherlands, and thereby cause a potential data security risk. And that is the part that I have been looking at. What are the laws and regulations that govern data in China, and to what extent might they affect the functioning of these products here? The second question is, what is it on the technical side in the way that these vehicles are designed and built that we may need to look at? And that's the part that John primarily will speak about. So let us start with the legal and regulatory environment for data in China. And there is actually quite a collection of different legal regimes that potentially govern data and data security in electric vehicles and drones. And so in the report, I've just gone through them one by one. There is a maturing data governance legislative framework in China that mainly rests on two pillars: the Personal Information Protection Law and the Data Security Law. Now, the Personal Information Protection Law does pretty much what it says. It protects personal information. In that sense, it's relatively comparable to the GDPR that we have here in Europe. And if you just look at the scope of the legislation only applies to the personal data of individuals within China, with some limited exceptions that the Personal Information Protection Law might apply extraterritorially insofar as it concerns the activities whereby the personal information of Chinese residents is used, for instance, to analyze their behavior. So if I operate, say, an e-commerce platform that sells to people in China and I use their personal information as a Dutch company to target advertising in China, then the Personal Information Protection Law would apply to me. But very simply, it does not apply to Chinese branded vehicles and drones in Europe. And so in that sense, the Chinese government would simply be unable to use that piece of legislation as a way of demanding access to whatever data might be collected, stored by and on those products. The second element is the Data Security Law. And this essentially covers all data, not just personal information, in a bid to protect Chinese national security. At the heart of this law is the assertion that it is possible to categorize data into three categories: ordinary data, important data, and national core data, with increasing tiers of protection for each of those categories of classification. The big problem that we have with the data security law is we're now nearly 4 years into it having entered force, and we still have not a single catalog that actually tells us how that data is supposed to be categorized. So that's just something that we don't know. There are some clauses in this piece of legislation that specify that the Chinese government might demand companies for data if Chinese national security risks are present. There are no reported cases where the Chinese government has actually availed themselves of that article. And so we don't actually quite know how risky the data security law might be, or how the Chinese government might be able to leverage that law in order to potentially gain information to data collected by, stored on drones and electric vehicles. And whether that is even technically possible is a whole other question, and that's something that John will also discuss. So this is primarily a matter that I would say we cannot fully answer that question right now, but we need to monitor it, right? And this is one of these areas where just keeping an eye on things is probably a very good idea. Outside of those pieces of data legislation, there are also data-related provisions in specialized sectoral regulations. And there are rules on automotive data, and there are rules on data collected by drones. And those rules, by and large, verge towards more cybersecurity rather than less. So Chinese regulations, for instance, call for electric vehicles to not store a very significant amount of data, right? So in the same way that, so for instance, imagine that you're a car that's trying to cross an intersection. It's okay for the sensors on the car to see whether it's safe to cross that intersection, but not to remember it, right? So that data must be deleted instantly. Other categories of data have very limited shall we say, or very strong constraints on the extent to which it can be processed out of the vehicle. Now, this can go very far, right? There are provincial regulations that require car makers to switch on a warning light when the car believes that sensitive personal information is being collected. So there's also a lot of discussion about transparency to users. Is this important to us? Yes and no. No, in the sense that these are Chinese rules and they only apply to vehicles and drones sold within China. Yes, in the sense that, on the one hand, in very many cases, these are Chinese iterations of global standards. Again, John will discuss that in greater depth. And also, yes, in the sense that in the absence of regulations on such questions in Europe, and to a very significant degree, for instance, the GDPR has not quite caught up yet with the reality of smart vehicles. This is going to be how these products are designed. And in that sense, it's actually quite interesting and perhaps heartening to see that in China too, automotive and drone regulators are verging towards more security and less ability for whichever hostile actors to hack into your car or into your drone and obtain data. That should cause us perhaps more comfort than concern. And this is perhaps a very weird sort of line of argumentation to take at a point in time where we are all very much panicking about China. But perhaps there's less to see here than we thought in the first place. However, there are two further elements that I do think bear mentioning and monitoring. The first is the cybersecurity law. Now, when it comes to data itself, the cybersecurity law has been substantively, shall we say, superseded by the data security law and the personal information protection law, and purely on data. There's nothing in the cybersecurity law that would generate additional risks above and beyond those that I discussed in the sections on personal data and data security. But there is something else that we may need to think about, and that is vulnerability disclosure. China has very strict vulnerability disclosure rules which require digital product manufacturers, and that can be anything, to immediately disclose, or nearly immediately disclose, vulnerabilities that they find to government. And obviously that is also true for Chinese car and drone manufacturers. It is equally true for non-Chinese car, and to the extent that they exist, drone manufacturers that have operations in China. So Volkswagen equally, Toyota equally must submit those vulnerabilities to the Chinese government. And companies have been extremely reticent to go public with more information as to how they are actually abiding by those rules. But that is a matter that might require some further observation. And then there's obviously the question of China's much maligned national intelligence law. And we all know it. It's the law that says that companies and individuals have to collaborate with intelligence collection, right? And this article is used left, right, and center to say, look, when the Chinese intelligence service wants something, there's no way in which anyone can refuse. And this is where we come to a particular point when you're in the sort of analysis business that I am, and that is that, I'm a lawyer, I like giving a legal answer to questions, but here we are faced with what I call a donut, right? There's a lot about which we can talk. There's always a hole in the middle of things we simply cannot know. And I think part of my job is to make sure that that hole is as small as I can make it, but it's never ever going to disappear. And this is also why the discussion about the national intelligence law you could talk about, it actually contains some limited safeguards. There's actually the punishment provisions in the national law for non-collaborations are actually very light. But in a way that doesn't matter, because we also know that the Chinese state can be quite cruel and violent if it wishes to be. So here we end up in a sort of political analysis, a will they, won't they sort of analysis, where we can never come to a certain conclusion. Could Chinese intelligence services try to use Chinese branded vehicles as vectors for intelligence collection? There's nothing in the laws of physics that would stop them. But similarly, there's nothing in the laws of physics that would prevent me from punching all of you in the face right now. And yet we all proceed on the presumption that I won't, right? So the question really is, what would it take for the Chinese government, what would weigh on that decision, not just in Chinese intelligence services, because intelligence services around the world tend to go for more rather than less, but also for the broader coordination wherein that would happen. And here you could also make the argument that the Chinese electric vehicle industry is a critical sector for the realization of China's new industrial strategy. And surely someone in Beijing must know that that these vehicles are under massive magnifying glasses, that everyone's on the lookout, not even for a smoking gun, but for a 6-year-old child's drawing of a smoking gun that they can, go public with. And that therefore, if there are clear vulnerabilities and exploitations of these vehicles, they will be discovered fairly quickly, and they will essentially mean the end for the international sales prospects, or at least to a very significant degree, curtail the international sales prospects of Chinese EVs. So that is a sort of risk-reward discussion that surely must be going on in Beijing somewhere, if the intelligence services were even thinking about doing that. Another argument you could make is that if I were a Chinese senior intelligence officer, I would probably not try to hack into Chinese vehicles because they're under that magnifying glass. I'd be trying to hack into Mercedes instead. Because the harsh lesson of cybersecurity is that if you have an adversary who has enough resources and patience, everything can be hacked in the fullness of time. So it's very unsatisfactory in the sense that we can't give a sort of purely legal answer to that question. But let us also please try and move beyond the very simplistic narrative of, the Chinese government can just compel businesses to do whatever it wants. Things are a little bit, it's not because the Chinese government faces no legal constraints in that sense on its action, that it faces no constraints. And, it faces material constraints. Is this actually technically possible? And this is what John will discuss. And it faces political constraints because within Beijing itself, Chinese intelligence services too have to navigate coordination and collaboration with the entire rest of the Chinese government. And with that, I would like to hand the floor to John.
All right, thanks, Roger. Good morning, everyone, and happy Liberation Day. Roger has said that we aren't talking here about supply chain vulnerabilities and the, let's say, wider political context. I think maybe as signposting, it is good to bear that in mind, because obviously when it comes to the bottom line for policymakers, there are trade-offs here. And the research question we've been given, as Roger said, is to shed some light on how data is transmitted and managed by Chinese-made drones and electric vehicles. But I suppose, macro question is whether such vehicles should be allowed to operate and be sold in European markets. And obviously that's a decision that's made in a larger context. I think that's a good segue into my section of the report, because of course it does begin with a brief overview based on, I must say, mid-2024 data of the presence of Chinese electric vehicles in European markets, which is still quite small. Again, just by way of signposting, we have essentially built this section of the report around 3 case studies. Firstly, looking at electric vehicles at BYD in particular, and at the open source project Lion Cage, basically cybersecurity and data security research around a NEO SUV model. And then for the drone section of the report, we've looked at DJI because, of course, they are by far the dominant presence in commercial drones. But to bring it back to what Roger said, and again to flag the overall conclusion, it's that really it is difficult to identify anything in terms of vulnerabilities on the part of these Chinese platforms, which is out of the ordinary for these industries. It comes ultimately down to a political question as to the level of motivation that you assign to the Chinese authorities, that donut problem that Roger just referred to. Because in terms of how the data is actually managed and transmitted on the part of these vehicles, what we have found is that really there is not much to distinguish these from other vehicles from other vendors of other nationality operating on the market. So regarding the regulatory context, the report does provide an overview of the regulatory situation in the EU as well as in China for both drones or electric vehicles and for drones. Just to run through quickly for those who are less familiar, vehicle manufacturers are, of course, ultimately responsible for managing the interfaces by which their platforms transmit data and how it is stored. That's often outsourced to cloud providers, and as we'll see, in the case of vehicles in the European Union at least, that is typically, in the case of the Chinese vendors, the big American and in some cases European cloud providers. In terms of the regulatory situation, there are requirements concerning cybersecurity certifications, in particular compliance with UN regulations 155 and 156, which have been mandatory in the EU since mid-2024. When we talk about higher level automated driving capabilities, so for example L3, with a vehicle able to make informed decisions based on environmental detection, UN 157. And again, the EU regulation requires compliance with these international standards. So what in practice that means is that, for example, onboard software has to be identified through standardized identification codes. There has to be an onboard data storage system, so-called black box, to use the analogy with airplanes, which records certain things, such as when the system initiates an automated traffic lane change, for instance. And certification for compliance with these rules is delegated basically to third parties. So one which is well known in the EU is TÜV Süd in Germany. And many of the security standards have also been developed by European industry. So, for example, TISAX AO3. And to use a case study, which we'll return to, Hesai, for example, which is one of the main Chinese providers of LiDAR, basically light imaging detection and ranging technology as a sensing technology on cars, is TISAX AO3 certified by TÜV Süd based on inspection of its data centers and its production facilities. So in that sense, Chinese vendors comply, if they operate in the European market, with the international standards and the industry standards, which other players also are required to comply with if they sell vehicles in the European market. One thing that's worth mentioning quickly also, because it does go to a lot of the security issues and the new developments, is the so-called V2X, vehicle to everything protocols, for intelligent vehicles to communicate with the surrounding infrastructure. In Europe, the standard is generally referred to as ITS-G5, which is a Wi-Fi based standard, whereas in the case of China, CV2X, which is based on cellular telecoms technology, which means, of course, that Chinese actors or it is based on international standards development in which Chinese actors have been heavily participating, for example, the third generation partnership for standardization of next generation telecoms. So within China itself, the regulatory and standard system for intelligent driving, because we are, of course, not just talking about the electrification of vehicles, but the intelligentization of them. Again, the development of technologies where increasingly you are seeing high levels of automated driving capability and of vehicles transmitting data with the surrounding infrastructure as a means of delivering the newer generation services. I won't run through everything in the report, but let's just say that there has been a great deal of domestic standards development and implementation projects which have been rolled out in China over the last few years. One thing I will highlight, for instance, is that currently China is running a multi-city pilot project to implement vehicle-to-road cloud integration. And again, here we're talking about, among other things, forming unified standards and testing system for communication between the vehicle and, let's say, the roadside base stations to make those self-driving decisions. And as Rogier pointed out, there is a regulatory system around this in terms of how the data that is transmitted for that purpose is managed. And I also want to highlight here that the Chinese have been very conscious of the data security issues on their own terms. So the lack of information security standards in China has been one of the driving forces, or the perceived, I should say, information security deficits in many of these contexts have been a target of the regulation in China that has developed around this, and securing the personal data of the individuals as well as cybersecurity vulnerabilities in the development of this complex of technologies. So to deal briefly with the case studies for the vehicles, again, I won't go through these in detail. I'm happy to address them in the Q&A. Firstly, as I mentioned, BYD. It's worth flagging here, of course, to, again, situate this in the larger picture, that BYD is a company which has now surpassed Tesla as the world's largest seller of EVs. I should have, when I flagged this at the start, said that when I talk about Chinese vehicles still being a relatively small part of the European market, I would be surprised. I haven't looked at the latest figures, but even if you're talking about, let's say, the battery electric vehicle market, so full electric in Europe, whether Chinese vendors even at this point accounted for more than about 20% of the market. But we do need to recognize that BYD in particular is a company that looks like it's going to be extremely dominant to the extent that Tesla perhaps has been dominant in electric vehicle markets, not just in China, but in many third-party markets. And obviously, from a European viewpoint in terms of the mass adoption of these vehicles, it's important to follow these developments. So for example, when BYD is offering intelligent driving assistance on its vehicles for no additional cost, the equivalent of Tesla's full FSD service full self-driving, which it's actually not, but which Tesla charges several thousand US dollars for, then that has major implications for the competitiveness and the attractiveness of the vehicle, obviously, to European consumers as well as those in third markets. But in terms of the data management, effectively within European markets, as I flagged earlier, a lot of the cloud service provision and the data storage is done by non-Chinese and in particular American and European cloud vendors. If we skip slightly forward to the case study of Project Lion Cage and the NEO SUV, this was likewise identified to be the case, that cloud vendors such as Amazon Web Services, European providers of these services, are the ones which are in charge of delivering, for example, over-the-air updates for software, for providing the cloud computing services and the local hosting that is necessary in terms of latency of data transmission, so the speed of data transmissions that's needed to deliver, especially the increasingly intelligent driving services in Europe, but also to comply with legal regimes such as the GDPR, requiring storage of local data within the jurisdiction. As far as can be told from the public announcements by the companies, including the cloud providers such as AWS, this is not significantly different from non-Chinese vendors. In terms of the hardware on board, and also, of course, the onboard intelligent software, increasingly integrated with AI. So BYD, for example, has recently announced, as have several other Chinese car makers, that their artificial intelligence onboard software will be integrated with DeepSeek and increasingly, of course, with other Chinese AI agent providers. The hardware also often is still provided by, let's say, non-Chinese vendors. So in the case of the Project Lion Cage case study, for example, they've identified certain MCUs and other chips which are provided by European vendors. Yes, BYD in particular, because it is a very vertically integrated company, provides a lot of its own chips and increasingly software, which is an area where the Chinese companies tend to be ahead of their European competitors. But at the same time, if we're talking about the system on chip that is the master controller effectively for the data processing and transmission in current generation BYD models, that's still provided by NVIDIA, by the US artificial intelligence leader. Now, that's not to say, of course, that in future there won't be increasing import substitution by the Chinese. In the case of BYD, as a business model, you've already seen that to a high degree. And in terms of data security, obviously that does present potentially a mitigation issue in that if you accept that if the hardware and the software is provided by a Chinese firm, it is inherently more risky, it's an elevated risk profile, then of course a higher degree of Chinese content in the vehicle's hardware and software translates to an increased risk. But again, that comes down ultimately to a political assessment, we would suggest. Again, I won't go into detail with the Project Lion Cage findings. Let's just say that they did a very thorough teardown, again, of not just the hardware, but the data transmission that was done by this, it must be said, only one vehicle of one model series in one country, NEO SUV in Norway, operating on the roads in real conditions. And there was no smoking gun that was found. There was certain unexplained data transmission to China that should be flagged, and that has also been the case, as we'll get to shortly, with audits of DJI drones, but not to the extent that it has led the researchers to say unequivocally that there is something to see here, which is, again, in the nature of a smoking gun, or to distinguish the Chinese product from, let's say, its foreign competitors in terms of a risk profile. I have to say that, as Roger also alluded to, as an espionage vector, it should go without saying, really, that using electric vehicles or drones as a mass intelligence collection system or an espionage, let's say, actionable system is not the most efficient way that the Chinese state could go about achieving these goals. From what is known about alleged Chinese espionage activities and data collection activities abroad by the Chinese authorities, in the public domain at least, it is obviously much more targeted, and anything that is connected to the internet is effectively exposed to cyber espionage. So in this sense, again, we do not see the Chinese platforms as, by the mere virtue of being Chinese, providing, let's say, a priority espionage platform. To deal briefly with the drones issue, we do go in the first section of the report into the regulatory and data regulatory framework around Chinese drones. We've covered the civil UAV, so unmanned aerial vehicles, regulatory framework in Europe as well as in China to some degree. Just to summarize here, I will say that based on Chinese commentators' own assessments, the development of the UAV management system, so the airspace management system for drones, which is obviously an area of new development because they are new technology in China, is still significantly behind Europe, and is, as in many cases, in fact, you do see quite a lot of discussion about following European models in terms of developing this space in China, where it's still very much centralized under the General Civil Aviation Authority. And here we're talking about, for example, the requirement for drones to transmit information to allow real-time tracking and other data transmission requirements for managing the use of airspace by these new platforms. We have used, as I mentioned, DJI as the main case study, because they are by far the largest commercial drone vendor globally, not just in consumer drones, but also in industrial and agricultural use drones, which have also, their models in some of these areas have been the subject of some of the various security audits, which have been done over the years, because the issue of data security around Chinese platforms, such as drones, surprisingly enough, is not a new one. So to skip forward slightly, we do discuss the series of security audits which have been done not by Chinese providers, but by, for example, US defense contractors like Booz Allen Hamilton, some of the US national laboratories, into the data security issues around DJI drones. Again, the bottom line here is that a smoking gun as such has never been identified. There have obviously been security vulnerabilities, as is often the case for any data transmitting product identified. These have been remediated under supervision by the auditors. And despite the high level of scrutiny that the company has faced, I don't think that there, again, has ever been a study of a DJI product done, to my knowledge, which has identified something which would not be considered within the margin of error for a provider of such products. DJI itself does obviously engage publicly in this space. They publish an online drone security white paper annually, disclosing details about, among other things, their products' wireless communication protocol, security features of the apps that you use to control the platforms from your smartphone, for example, Android and iOS, and also, for instance, their bug bounty program. So that's rewards for identifying security vulnerabilities, reporting them back to the company. It might also be worth flagging briefly that again, if you're talking about the content of the products, then you are seeing an increasingly high degree of import substitution, where more and more of the components are provided by Chinese companies. And some of these entities, of course, are on US sanctions lists, such as the Chinese military companies list or the entity list operated by the Commerce Department. But that in itself is certainly not, in a technical sense, a smoking gun. There's all kinds of reasons why a given Chinese entity may be, on very broad national security grounds, put on a US sanctions list. So to wrap that up, again, we will quite happily talk to our conclusions and recommendations in the Q&A. But in terms of characterizing the data management and transmission of Chinese-made vehicles on the roads or drones in the air, there is no smoking gun, and it has to be said that the Chinese platforms, if anything, exhibit quite a high degree of certainly compliance with the regulatory frameworks, because otherwise they couldn't be sold in European or foreign markets, but also with the international security standards which are developing around these industries. So we return again to the fundamental point, which is that the issue of the Chinese state's ability to weaponize such platforms is fundamentally a political one. It's not one which can be remediated through technical or legal analysis, to put it quite bluntly. What we can say is that on their own terms, there is not a strong case for identifying Chinese-made products based on nationality as an elevated risk simply on technical grounds. Now, that's not to say that something may not come up in future which does justify such a conclusion. But for the time being, we are quite comfortable in saying that we have not found it.